class of Tanis Thursday.
That's it.
Good morning, everyone. While we're waiting for our stream to stream, hopefully it will. It looks like we're on live. We're on live now. Might take a minute or so for him to get it. We want to dedicate our class this morning, Le'ilui Nishmas Chaya Udal Bas Reb Yaakov Leib. That's Brenda's mother, whose Yurtzeit is coming up tonight. I don't know how many of you remember Brenda's mother, but I certainly do. She was an extraordinary woman who pretty much throughout all the time that I knew her battled lupus and had this incredibly positive attitude that despite physical challenges, right? Despite physical challenges, just tell them to hang on, right? Despite physical challenges, really managed to build an incredible life together with her partner, your father, Zichrono Livracha, and Yirtzeh Hashem, our Torah learning this morning should be an aliyah for her neshama. Okay. Actually, in Brent.
Do you see when it comes on?
He did.
I do not, but I can. Okay. Tell me if it doesn't. Leave your phone on, Sue. If it doesn't come up in a few minutes, you should try again. Call back.
What did I say?
Say
No,
leave your.
It's not the class on Chulin. Just look at this. Look at the black box that says offline. It'll say online.
It should start to say. It should say online soon.
It still says offline?
Reload the page. Push F5 and reload the page.
Push
Now it's complicated.
Push F5.
No, tell him it's too.
All right, Dad. If it doesn't work, I'll tell you when I can.
Okay. Click on the link again. Tell him to click
So
on the.
listen to Chulin.
Tell him to click on the link again.
Okay, Dad. Love you.
Okay. Okay, everyone. So,
Bye.
yeah, I don't know why there is a lag often with this. Okay.
Try.
Maybe now he'll get last week.
That's a leg.
Okay. So, I want to complete this last piece of Parshas Korach, which is here the gifts to the Levium. So I'm on actually page 834. I hope you'll join me there. Before we move on to the Levium, there are two aspects that I want to share with you. Number one is that the Torah calls this agreement between Hashem and the Kohanim and Bnei Yisrael a bris melach, a covenant of salt. So what's the idea of a covenant of salt? So Rashi points out to us two things. If you look at Rashi on page 834, in the left column, 3 lines up from the bottom, Rashi says, Bris melech olam, an eternal salt-like covenant. So Rashi says about that, Karas bris im Aharon, right, that a Kadosh Baruch Hu used as a symbol of this agreement, of this covenant, of this promise to Aharon, but davar havri, a matter that makes, with a substance that creates health, umiskayim umavri es acherim, and also is able to help other people. That salt helps the individual and salt helps other people as well. Interestingly, what does that mean? That salt helps an individual and salt helps other people as well. So we know that what?
Preserves food.
So we certainly know that salt preserves food. It enables one to eat. It enables others to eat also. Salt is an important component of the body. In other words, you need to have salt, sodium, in your diet. If you don't have sodium in your diet, everything gets messed up and
Electrolyte balance.
Correct. Thank you very much. Okay, and additionally, we know that that salt. Be careful, not too much salt, right? Of course, but salt, as we know, is also something that doesn't spoil. In other words, you can keep salt forever. If it's damp, so you know the salt is going to get clustery, hardened. But if you keep salt in a place where it is protected from the dampness, salt will stay forever. And that's the idea, that it is a covenant, it is an everlasting covenant. Like salt is an everlasting substance, so too this agreement, this covenant, this deal between Hashem and Bnei Aharon is the same thing. It is an everlasting covenant, which brings to mind the interesting... Excuse me?
Is that part of the reason that so much salt is used in kosher? Would that be?
No, it has nothing to do with it. Right, nothing to do with it. The reason that we use salt in koshering is that salt has as one of its chemical properties the ability to pull out, to draw out liquid, and therefore when meat is covered with salt, what happens is the liquid of the blood that is drawn out of the meat.
I just thought maybe there was a holiness.
To a kedusha to the salt.
Yes,
No, not necessarily a kedusha to the salt. That's the process. I mean, we don't kosher meat. I don't know if anybody ever kosher meat.
I did.
No, in the olden days we used to kosher meat,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. I'm telling you, I have children who think that they think that animals come wrapped in saran wrap on styrofoam. They simply do not chop how it gets from one place to the other. It's an important lesson for them to learn. But generally we don't salt meat today. We buy it kosher already. Of course, it is a problem sometimes for individuals who are on a very restricted salt diet, because kosher meat is saltier than non-kosher made meat. So all kinds of ways in which to deal with that by additional soaking of the meat, or also sometimes you can buy meat, it's very hard these days, but sometimes you can buy meat which is not yet koshered, and you can kosher it yourself over an open fire. Like liver, like one would do with liver. It is possible to do. It's a little bit complicated because it trapes up everything that you use, but it is possible to do. Okay.
I heard this. It was the first machloket when the Shemayim and the Mayim were separated. It was a machloket that the waters were separated, and it was very upsetting.
The waters above and the waters below, and the salt of the waters below complained to Hashem, and Hashem promised them that they would be elevated, that they would be used on the mizbeach. Right, that was the component. They would be used on the mizbeach. Right, one of the reasons why we dip challah in salt. Right, one of the connections, the reason why we dip challah in salt. I don't know what the connection is to spreading margarine on challah with salt, but okay. But certainly challah with challah, to it so it adheres. Right, certainly challah with salt. My grandchildren think it's salt with challah, but okay. So that's one element that I wanted to point out to you. And the second element is an interesting component because it applies not only to the Kohanim, but it applies to a certain extent to the Leviim as well. And that is that we would say commonly that the Kohanim and the Leviim did not have an inheritance in the land of Israel. That they did not inherit land. There was no division of land given to Shevet Levi, right? Shevet Levi meaning including the Kohanim. So obviously the question is why. If you look at the pasuk, where on page 834, pasuk Chaf, pasuk 20, Vayomer Hashem el Aharon. Hashem said to Aharon, Bi'artzam, in your land, or in the land, their land, the land of Bnei Israel, lo sinchal. You shall not inherit, v'chelek lo yelecha b'socha, and you will not have a part in it, Ani chelkecha v'nachalasecha. I am your part, your portion, and your inheritance, besoch b'nei Yisrael, among the Jewish people. So we have this idea that the Kohanim, Shevet Levi, and the Kohanim are not to be landowners in the traditional sense of the word. Now, when we say they're not to be landowners in the traditional sense of the word, it means that there was no place, no tract of land that was distributed to Shevet Levi. However, Leviim and Kohanim were able to own land. How did that happen? Where were Leviim and Kohanim able to learn land, to own land? We read in the Gemara about transactions, land transactions
Outside of
between
Israel.
Leviim and Kohanim and Bnei Israel, or even within Israel. Right, even within Israel, they didn't invest in real estate overseas at that point. But even within Israel, there was an ability for Kohanim and Leviim to own land. And where was that? So where did the Kohanim and Leviim live? We know where they worked, right? They worked in the Beis Hamikdash. But other than Yomim Tovim, when all Kohanim and Leviim had to be hands-on, there was a Seder Ha'avot, there was a rotation of Kohanim and Leviim. The Kohanim and Leviim were divided up into Mishmaros. Mishmaros it was a rotation. And within that rotation, they were further divided up by Beis Av, by families. So they did not work 52 weeks out of the year. According to some, Kohanim only worked 2 or 3 days out of the year. I'm talking about in addition to Yomim Tovim. When Yomim Tovim, the Kohanim all worked. But because there was a crush of karbanos and of individuals, so all the Kohanim worked, Yomim Tovim. But on a regular weekday, so generally, only a small group of Kohanim worked. What did the rest of them do?
They waited for their assignment.
What?
Study.
So study. So we know studying and teaching, exactly. We know that the Leviim were involved in teaching Bnei Israel. The Kohanim were involved in teaching Bnei Israel. This was part, right? This was part of their spiritual responsibility, not just to do the avoda in the Mishkan or in the Beis Hamikdash, but also to teach Bnei Yisrael, exactly what they're supposed to teach Bnei Yisrael, we're going to talk about, but to teach Bnei Yisrael, right? And so that's what they did. I am sure there were Kohanim and Leviim who also had businesses, right? Even if they didn't have land, they had businesses.
Because you told us last week that their donations, they could convert them to other kinds of
right. So we know,
services. So that's a business.
Correct. So we know they had businesses, and we know that they were able to make these transactions, absolutely. But primarily studied and taught, right? Learned and taught. And interestingly, we know, where did they live? Anybody, you ever thought about it? Where did the Kohanim live? They all didn't live in the Beis Hamikdash, right? Where did they live? They lived in the 48 Levitical cities. There were 48 cities in Eretz Yisrael that were designated as Levitical cities. Now, where did these Levitical cities come into play? So we know there's a concept of something called an Ir Miklat. An Ir Miklat is a city of refuge. Not the way in which, right? Not the way in which we talk about sanctuary cities today, but literally sanctuary cities in a different way. There's an interesting halacha which I don't want to go into now, but is a fascinating halacha in itself of Goel Hadam. Goel Hadam is literally translated as a blood avenger. And what does that mean? That means if someone kills your relative, so you have the right to kill that individual. You have the right to kill the killer without a trial, without
Street justice.
A kind of street justice. It's a difficult concept. It seems like a little bit like the Wild Wild West, right? It's a difficult concept, and how, whether or not Goel Hadam applies today, and all of the I guess the permutations of it. What happens if, how can you go ahead and kill somebody? You don't know what the circumstances were, et cetera, et cetera. But let's just put that aside for the time being. If a person committed murder, either purposely or inadvertently, right? The famous case of an individual who goes into the forest to chop wood, and as he swings back with the axe, the blade of the axe comes loose from the handle and kills somebody who's standing behind him, an inadvertent death. So the murderer runs to the Ir Miklat. Okay, and that was why? To save himself from the Goel Hadam. Meaning, once you've murdered someone, either purposely or inadvertently, you run to the Ir Miklat. Now, if you murdered somebody purposely and you run to the Ir Miklat doesn't help you. It saves you from the Goel Hadam, but what does it not save you from?
Court system.
The court system, from Beis Din. Right? So it saves you from the Goel Hadam, but it does not save you from the court system.
Who's to know?
What?
Who's to know?
Every person who ran to the Ir Miklat had to be had to be vetted, right? Had to be vetted, had to undergo a process of a Beis Din. In other words, you didn't just, right? People didn't just show up in the Ir Miklat because they were looking for a cheap place to live, right? You lived in the Ir Miklat if you were in danger of being killed by the Goel Hadam, right? So,
But then you couldn't leave.
and you couldn't leave, right?
Right.
Well, what I'm saying, you couldn't leave if you were not yet tried by Beis Din. If you were tried by Beis Din and found to be guilty of inadvertent killing, so then you could leave. No, then I'm sorry, you could not leave, right? You could not leave either way. But if you were found to be guilty of actual premeditated murder, the Beis Din would kill you, right? The Beis Din would kill you. If the circumstances were not present, meaning, let's say that there weren't witnesses, or there was one witness, or the circumstances were questionable, or you killed somebody accidentally. So yes, Susan is right. You could not leave from the Ir Miklat, because if you did, your life would be in jeopardy. The Goel Hadam could kill you. Could you go from one Ir Miklat to another? And the answer is quickly, right? You'd have to, right? If you can get from one Ir Miklat to the other without being killed by the Goel Hadam, okay? So then you were protected when you entered into the second Ir Miklat.
Guy then died.
When the
Then
Kohen,
your accuser,
Goel Hadam.
right, if your accuser,
if the Goel Hadam dies, okay, and there's no other Goel Hadam,
But you
you're
have
safe.
family.
then you
Right?
can go back to living.
Then you're safe. But exactly who is the Goel Hadam, and that's there's more than one individual as a Goel Hadam.
Is that like
When
a blood
was-
revenge?
what?
Is that a blood revenge?
Yes, yes.
That's exactly.
When was there a communal pardon of all murderers in the Ir Miklat?
Do you believe
When the Kohen Gadol died. When the Kohen Gadol died, so then the slate was wiped clean, and all people who were convicted of inadvertent murder could go free. Okay? And interestingly, the Gemara tells us the mother of the Kohen Gadol used to visit the Ir Miklat cities and provide the residents there with food and all kinds of treats. Why?
Keep her son alive.
Because otherwise, if you were in the Ir Miklat, what would you be doing? You'd be
Taking out a
davening.
Right.
You'd be davening for the death of the Kohen Gadol.
I don't know
So,
if they'd be
right? So the
Cities had a lot of unsavory characters.
No, they were inadvertent.
Well, not, right,
well,
Accidents happen.
the most unsavory characters were hopefully executed, but they didn't execute people that often. So
Right.
one must assume there were plenty of unsavory characters in the Ir Miklat. Right? One has to assume that. And she would come and she would bring this food and treats for the residents of the Ir Miklat, so that they wouldn't daven for the death of her son.
So
Now-
who paid for the residents? whose taxes would pay for the cities? Just joke. I'm
Whose
serious.
taxes would pay for the city?
And
What
how
does that
would-
mean?
no, I mean, if God forbid
Who
you're
supported
innocent, and then you have to live here, do you pay for living there, or it's like?
Of course. If you're innocent of what?
The acts, let's say the acts.
Well, you're not innocent. It might be not premeditated, but you're not innocent. In other words, if you kill someone inadvertently,
So get over it.
you still have to be in that Ir Miklat, right? You are an inadvertent killer. Yes, you're not going to be executed, but you are an inadvertent killer. So you do.
Oh, so you pay for your estate there, I see.
You do. Right? I mean, you have to work, right? There's, it's not like jail.
Not
when
a
you
free ride.
right, when you go to jail,
State
it's
pays.
it's free food, free board, right?
Education.
Medical care?
Free medical care, free education,
You have
Um,
three hot things.
what? 3 hots in a cot.
But now they say it's 2 hours.
All right, 3 hots in a cot, 2 hots in a cot, right? You have a gym on premises, you have unlimited access to it. It's for some people it's not a bad gig, I guess, right? That's what they say,
White collar.
right? That's what they say. But we have this, right? But nevertheless, so this Ir Miklat was not a jail. People had to bear responsibility for their own survival in the Ir Miklat, right? They had to work, they had to provide, had to purchase food, things like that. But in addition to the designated cities that were set aside in Eretz Yisrael, 3 Ir Miklat, Arei Miklat, the additional 48 Levitical cities also served as an Ir Miklat.
That's an interesting.
Right? They also served as an Ir Miklat. So you would, whichever city was closest, that's the city. If it was a city of the Leviim, or if it was the designated general Ir Miklat, that's where you would go. So the
An
Leviim.
in-house chaplain you have.
Yes, well, correct. You did have an in-house chaplain, and the idea of why would a city that belonged to the Levium, why would that be an appropriate Ir Miklat? Precisely for that reason, right? I mean, imagine what could be more rehabilitative than going to a city filled with people who are sitting and learning and teaching, right? That's a wonderful opportunity for an individual to rehabilitate himself, right? To do tshuva, right?
When did
So,
it die out, this whole, like this last
When
time?
the temple.
That's when,
it's an interesting question, right? When did I guess when Beis Din stopped executing people for murder, right? When Beis Din stopped executing people for murder, they moved out of the Beis Hamikdash because murders were rampant. So then they I'm thinking, I don't know, it's an interesting question. I'm thinking that maybe that's when this whole process stopped as well, but I'm not sure. Interesting question. I'll have to do some homework on that.
I mean, there's
Okay.
not that many cities in the whole country, so 48 sounds like almost every city was.
Well, the 48 cities were spread out. It's not like, right? I mean, imagine, but just imagine you kill somebody inadvertently in Israel and you got to get to a city. You can't exactly, ask and, call that Uber, to come pick you up and take you to the closest Ir Miklat, right? You had to get there, even if you got there by riding on an animal, one has to assume it took some time. And, so 48 safe zones spread out throughout Israel does not seem to me to be an overabundance of safe zones. In other words, you had to make an effort. You really had to make an effort to go there. Okay.
There was
So-
some on the other side of the Ardennes.
Correct. There were 3.
Oh,
Whoops.
It's okay. Thank you. There were 3 on the other side of the Ardennes. Okay. 3 Arei Miklat on the other side. That's what happens.
where's your computer? That is me, I'm sorry.
What? I'm more worried about the Chumash.
Well, you had that.
Was there a rule about?
If you have to dry off your Chumash or your computer first.
No.
Just put some papers in between, underneath the,
Okay, we'll be okay. Okay. Gosh.
That's why you
Okay.
don't drink around a.
And it's only coffee. It's not anything else. I promise you. I just got it from over there. Okay. So yes, there were cities. There were 3 cities on the other side of the Yarden as well. So the Levium, the way we got to this was because the Levium did indeed have cities. And within those Levitical cities, which is where they made their homes, they obviously owned property within those Levitical cities. And I am sure they were able to transact business with the properties they owned. You know, maybe there were fields that they owned, or maybe there were they could rent out facilities that they had to other people. So the Levium and the Kohanim did have property, but they did not have the kind of property that would provide an income for them from agriculture, which was the primary mode of support when the Jews came into Eretz Yisrael. Right, the primary mode of support was agriculture, and we'll see the ramifications of that in a few minutes. So they have no chelek and no nachala. What is the difference between a chelek and a nachala? What's the difference between those two? Anybody want to guess something? No? Okay. So the Meforshim,
Inheritance?
what? Nachala is an inheritance. Rav Hirsch says nachala is connected to the word nachal. What is a nachal? A stream. Okay? Just like a stream goes from one place to another, a nachala, right, goes from one generation to the other. And you pass down something from one generation to the other, right?
Down the avoda.
Well, hold on. You pass down something from one generation to the
It's
other.
karka.
So it's usually something which is karka as opposed to metaltalin. Although when we think of inheritance today, in our world, in our experience, we don't think of karka. We don't think of karka as real estate, property. We don't think of property as an inheritance. Although a generation ago, our parents and grandparents certainly did think of real estate as an inheritance. In other words, when they first came here, there were many who purchased real estate, and there were many who subsequently wished they had purchased real estate.
Yeah.
And the reason for purchasing that real estate was not only to acquire wealth, but also to have something to pass down to a subsequent generation. I think that in our society today, we generally do not look at it that way. We generally view real estate as for
To live in.
right, to live in, not necessarily as an inheritance. However, Rav Hirsch explains in an interesting way. He says that this was not to be the inheritance of the Kohanim. Why? Because the Kohanim were to be divorced from the reality of practical living. Interesting concept. Rav Hirsch actually says, if you look at the first word of verse 20, it says Vayomer, right? Vayomer Hashem. And Rav Hirsch says, if you go back and look at go back to page 830.
From what?
What?
Reality.
Divorced from practical reality. Go back to 830, and what do you see? What's the first word at the bottom of the page in verse 1? Vayomer. Rav Hirsch says, Vayomer is indicative of continuity. It doesn't indicate a new mitzvah. To indicate a new mitzvah, it would say Vayidaber, not Vayomer. Vayidaber indicates a new mitzvah. Vayomer is a continuous statement connected to what comes before it. The beginning of this whole section in chapter 18 was connected to the fear that, if you remember, the fear that the people had about dying when coming in contact or in proximity to the Mishkan. So the commandments to the Kohanim and the Leviim to set up boundaries and to protect the people from transgressing those boundaries was a continuation. So too, Rav Hirsch wants to suggest that this pasuk, verse 20, is a continuation of what preceded, meaning that everything that came before this spoke about the compensation, or if you will, that the Kohanim would receive for their work, their avoda. So yes, part of it was for their avoda in the Beis Hamikdash, right? When they brought karbanos, they were entitled to certain parts of the karbanos. But in addition to that, when they weren't working in the Beis Hamikdash, they were entitled to other things. And that was we spoke about truma, this 1/40th, 1/50th, or 1/60th of produce, which was given to the Kohanim. That was a lot. If you can imagine, all of the farmers, all of the agriculture in the land literally went to support the Kohanim. Why did it go to support the Kohanim? Because the Kohanim were involved in the spirit, in the infusing into the physical, the spiritual. Think about what a karban is. Bringing a karban is a very physical act, right? Those of you who have, I remember as a young parent taking my children to petting zoos, and as a still young grandparent taking my grandchildren to petting zoos, and realizing that animals can be intimidating, right? That these cute little goats, that you think about, right? That you read in the storybooks about what happens when you have a handful of feed, right? These goats they get aggressive, right? They get aggressive.
Even when you feed them paper.
They get aggressive. I remember one of them chewing on one of my child's tzitzis. Videos or home videos of that, right? But the goats get aggressive. And cows are big animals, right? Cows are big animals. We see them from the road. We say, oh, look how cute they are. But they are huge animals. So bringing a karban was a very physically experiential happening. And in order to ensure that karban did not leave only a physical impression on an individual, the job of the Kohanim was to infuse it with spirituality. That was the essence of their avoda. Their avoda was to infuse the physical with spiritual meaning. If that was the case, then they were really detached from the physical world, right? They were not supposed to benefit. They were not supposed to work. They were not supposed to benefit from that work. That was the ideal status of the Kohen, was to sit and learn and to teach. That was what he was supposed to be doing. Some of the Meforshim say that it would take 6 months for the Kohanim to prepare for their few days in the Beis Hamikdash. Because theoretically, theoretically, it's interesting, right? What was the curse of the Nachash? What was the curse of the Nachash? Had to crawl, correct? Couldn't walk anymore. Couldn't stand upright. Had to crawl, but there was another. Had to eat the dust, right? Had to eat the dust, right? Eat dirt. So on the one hand, eating dirt does not seem to be a pleasant thing. On the other hand, you're never going to go hungry, right? You're never going to go hungry. There's plenty of dirt around, right? So you're never going to go hungry. And that was part of the curse. That was part of the curse, that the Nachash should not feel dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, if you always have everything, if you don't have a sense of dependency, it deprives you of a certain element of spirituality, right? That was the whole lesson of the man in the Midbar. In other words, you couldn't get takeout. You couldn't store it for the next day. It was every day you got up and said,
what are we eating today?
Yeah, what's for breakfast, right? Every day. And every day you had to go out and get it, right? But you had a certain belief that every day it would be there. It might get further and further away from you, but every day it would be there. That was to teach us to trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu and not to think that what we earn, what we gain, what we eat comes from our own efforts. The same as Bikurim, the same as lots of these things, right? Even giving a piece of the karban to the Kohen is a reminder that it's, it's not all from me, right? It's not, yes, I have to put my effort in, I have to go out to work, I have to do, but if I'm successful or not is ultimately dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that is this sense of spirituality. And for the Kohen, You know what happens when we get involved in physical activity, in the daily gashmias of the week, is we lose that sense of spirituality. There is a quote in the name of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zichrono Livracha, that says, I'm willing to allow people to think about work in shul if they think about shul in work. In other words, the idea that when you leave the shul in the morning, or when you leave the Beis Medrash and you go out to work, then you leave behind everything that you were saying, everything that you were learning. That's not a Jewish idea. And it was the job of the Kohanim to inspire people to do this. Therefore, the Kohanim had to be separate from this Gashmias world, from this practical reality of earning a living, so that they could focus on that spirituality. That was their job. If that was their job, it makes perfect sense, says Rav Hirsch, that they wouldn't be given any land, that they wouldn't have the responsibility to work land in order to earn a living, that it would be the responsibility of other Jews who needed that spiritual infusion to take care of them, Okay.
But they were allowed to have wives, they were allowed to have families.
You had to do
So
that.
that's part of the practical world. They didn't take vows of poverty. They didn't give
That's
up.
correct.
They were certainly had a
Well, to the extent that they were obligated to fulfill mitzvahs like anybody else, the mitzvah of having children is a mitzvah incumbent on everyone.
I understand that, but they're not removed from
Right? They're
life.
not
They're
they're not
celibate.
right.
They're
It's
not
not like
poverty,
correct.
They
They're
don't-
not monks. They're not priests.
In other words,
correct.
what are they sacrificing in terms of having this very special role aside of not owning land? Yet
They are-
they do have all the let's put it this way. They're not. They
Perks.
can right. I don't want to say it that way, but there are many financial benefits to being a Kohen in addition to having the spiritual inheritance. So it's not as if they're really, what are they giving up aside from the physical,
Freedom
the
and choice.
physicality
So-
of land in this earth?
Okay,
they
so
get
that's
land
so that's
in
a, right. So that's a big deal. In other words, giving up. If I have land, so in my head, I think to myself that I will always have parnasa. I might have a little bit more parnasa. I might have a little bit less parnasa, but I will always have parnasa depending on my efforts. That's what I think about land, right? How many of us go to work saying, you know what? If Hashem is good to me today, I'll make a good parnasa today. We go to work thinking, okay, I have to, what I do today is going to impact on my ability to earn a living. Right? If I go to work and play Candy Crush, so ultimately that's going to come back to bite me. If I don't produce, if I don't write articles, if I don't bring in clients, if I don't see patients, right? If I don't do those things, I'm not going to earn a living, right? So that practical concern was removed from the Kohanim, right? It was removed from the Kohanim. Yes, they had to support their family. Yes, they had to support their slaves if they had any, and they were allowed to do that from the truma that they got.
But my point is, they are living a normal existence in terms of family in an isolated little bubble. The idea that they have a portion in the world to come, as opposed to the people who worked the land and had to earn that portion. Were they guaranteed a place in the world to come?
So I think you're looking at Chelek and Nachala of Hashem, meaning that they were guaranteed a place in the world to come.
I mean, that's a good deal,
Right? So
too.
we know that every person,
That's what we
every
strive
person
for.
has a place in the world to come, unless you transgress certain major things. Right? Every person has a place in the world
So
to
if
come.
the Kohanim do a good job inspiring you, you'll have a place in the land to come.
So, in other words, the Chelek v'Nachal of Hashem means that's where their efforts were to be devoted and dedicated to the spiritual component of the world. Yeah.
I never thought about this before, but how does this business model relate to the business model of Yisachar Zvulun? In other words, one was into the Gashmias to
So-
allow for the other
okay.
to be in the Ruchani.
So there's an interesting Rambam, if I can defeat the tech gremlins today, gremlins, whatever they're called. Listen to this Rambam. The Rambam writes as follows. I'll read it to you. Let me read it to you in English. The Rambam says, it's in Hilchos Shmita. The Rambam writes, not only the tribe of Levi, but any one of the inhabitants of the world whose spirit generously motivates him, and he understands with his wisdom to set himself aside and stand before God to serve him and minister to him and to know God, proceeding justly as God made him, removing from his neck the yoke of the many reckonings which people seek, he is sanctified as holy of holies. What does that mean?
If you
I think we need to
That's not so easy.
Right?
Anyone,
Right?
so you're saying anyone can achieve
The
this?
Rambam is saying is that this
Talmud
level
Chacham should
is that
separate
this
himself.
level of spiritual immersion
Right, like the yeshiva.
requiring support by the community can be achieved even by someone who's not a Kohen or a Levi. That if a person chooses to dedicate himself in his entirety to spiritual pursuits, then he is in this category of requiring or entitled to communal support.
Right, but the Yisachar Zvulun thing
Hold
were
on,
entire
hold
tribes.
on. God will be his portion and heritage forever, and will provide what is sufficient for him in this world, like he provides for the Kohanim and the Leviim. Right? It's a fascinating statement from the Rambam. You can't make yourself a Kohen from the perspective of being able to work in the Beis Hamikdash. You can't make yourself a Levi from the perspective of working in the Beis Hamikdash. But you can make yourself a holy individual who it's in the community's best interest to support. Now, this is not intended as a political statement regarding the controversy of whether we draft yeshiva students in Israel or don't draft yeshiva students in Israel. All right? I'm a firm believer that kollel and advanced learning, the way that it is currently practiced today, is a corruption of what it was intended to be at one time. At one time, it was intended to be for the best and the brightest, so that they would develop into advanced
Educators.
scholars and teachers. Right? Today, it's a little bit different.
It's abuse.
Whether it's good or not good, it's a little bit different today. But for individuals who really want to put themselves in this position, the Rambam opens the door here for them to be able to do that. Yisachar Zvulun relationship is a similar, not exactly, but a similar kind of arrangement. It was Yisachar and Zvulun, the name of two tribes. Zvulun was the tribe that had the tract of land that included access to the water. So Zvulun were a shevet engaged in trade, in overseas trade, in business. Business is referred to in Hebrew as pragmatia, right?
Practical,
What?
practical.
Practical, pragmatic, that's what they were involved in. And the Yisachar Zvulun relationship is used to describe a relationship where two people enter into this deal. One person says, okay, I will sit and learn. And the other person says, and I will go out to work and I will support you. And they share the learning, the schar of learning of the individual who sits and learns. Right? That's called the Yisachar Zvulun relationship. And it's not necessarily prevalent in our communities, but there are many communities in which the Yisachar Zvulun relationship is entered into by many people, supporting Talmidei Chachamim, in turn, not just giving tzedakah, but supporting them in turn for a chelek, a portion of their learning. So it is a big deal.
It's a business.
But,
It's a business, yeah.
Wouldn't you say the kollel husband and wife paradigm that's so prevalent is also like that?
And they're from the same shape.
The wives.
Not necessarily, right?
The wives
Yes,
are-
correct. That's correct. The kollel, Sue was talking about the traditional kollel model of a husband who sits and learns, and a wife who
Kills herself.
goes out to work and takes care of the children and
Well, sometimes
does the
when
wash
she
and the
feels
ironing and
everything
everything else.
Sit and learn all
Right,
the time.
right. Okay. Be that as it may, We're going to move ahead.
Like-
Pasuk 21. The Torah now turns its attention to the Leviim, and the Torah says, "V'livinei Levi," and to the Leviim, "Hinei nosati kol ma'aser b'Yisrael and nachala." What did the Leviim get? The Leviim got ma'aser. Right? What is ma'aser? The word ma'aser comes from the word eser, is the root, meaning a tenth. Right? Right? Remember, I'm a farmer. From my entire harvest, I separate out 1/40th, 1/50th, or 1/60th, and I give it to the Kohen. It is called truma. It is called truma. Then I then separate a tenth from my harvest. I give it to the Levi. It is called ma'aser or ma'aser rishon. It's either referred to just ma'aser, a tithe, in a general sense, or it has a specific name, ma'aser rishon, the first tithe, because there are several tithes. Okay? So it's ma'aser rishon. You give a tenth of your produce to the Levi. From this tenth of your produce that the Levi receives, he has to give to the Kohen. He has to give to the Kohen, right? And he has to give a tenth of what he receives to the Kohen. So the Kohen is getting, right? Kohen is getting from different places. He's getting from you, but he's also getting indirectly from you through what he gives to the Levi. And the Levi is not allowed to use what he receives until he separates out and gives his portion to the Kohen, right? So the Kohen is supported by the Levi as well. That's Ma'aser Rishon. Remember, the truma that the Kohen gets, either the truma he gets from you as the farmer or the truma he gets from the Levi, has a status of Kedusha. It has to be eaten while he is Tahor, and it can only be used for certain things. The status of Ma'aser that a Levi gets is not as intense. It does not need to be eaten in truma. It can be eaten anywhere under any circumstances, right? So it's a lower level of sanctity, Brenda.
There's not a kuppah for all Leviim. You pick your own Levi that you want to give.
Just like you picked your own Kohen, you
Right.
picked your own Levi you want to give.
Some people
Imagine
are
what
very
Sundays in Great Neck
successful
would be
and
like.
Some are very poor. Some Levi might be very
Correct.
friendly and,
That's correct.
you know,
That's
nobody
correct.
gets them. Not
There might
popular.
be an inequity. There might be an inequity in how produce is distributed.
So you mean that a farmer says, here's my tenth, but I'm gonna give it to Levi Arnold?
Correct.
So what if everyone liked Levi Arnold and he got more than 1/10?
It's a good question. It's a
So-
good question.
He had a
It
fire
happened.
resistance.
Right? It happened.
So how?
Right? It happened.
So there was no.
So what do you
equitable
think? What do you think happened to the other Levium? In other words, why did Levi Arnold get everything? Why? Because he was nice. Because he was a valued Levi. Because he taught people. Because he interacted with people. Well, what is that going to do for the other Levium?
Competition.
Influence them to
Sometimes
do
they
the
made
same.
Correct.
decisions that- but it
It's
worked
going.
the way
It's going to influence.
Behavior.
It's going to influence behavior.
Sometimes spiritual people need
Right.
not have the tools to interact socially, so someone would designate them as
They
nice.
go to finishing
In other
school
words,
and they get the tools.
What I'm saying is, we're talking about spirituality and God's message through an individual, that he has that ability. But how does the average man who was not selected for this, who doesn't have that wisdom, how is he able to recognize the true
Okay, so
person? I
so
mean, we don't
Raylene
have
is
that-
asking an interesting question from the perspective of: have you ever heard an academic speak?
Yeah.
A professor,
Yeah.
a professor give a
They
lecture or
use it to
something
talk
like that.
about it. They speak to
Okay?
people.
In other words, just because you are an academic, just because you are an intellect, does not mean that you are a good communicator, does not mean that you have social skills, doesn't mean that at all. However, we believe that a Torah educator is supposed to have those skills. Why? Because Darachecha Darchei Noham, right? The words of Torah, the ways of Torah are pleasantness, its paths are pleasant. So that if a person truly studies Torah, if a person truly allows Torah in, then it is going to impact on him or her as a person. So therefore, if you have a Levi who perhaps is not as engaged, because maybe he says, you know what, I'm going to sit more in the base medrash, I'm going to study more, I'm not going to worry about the people over there, and in turn he is not collecting what he needs to collect, he is going to be forced to change his way, to change his behavior, and to interact in a different kind of way with people around. Who will be the benefit of that? Well, yes, his family will benefit, but the people with whom he interacts will be the benefit of it, right? It's like the model that they have set up in summer camps for the kollel. It's very nice that guys come and sit and learn, but the nicest thing is that they reach out to other campers. They serve as role models, as inspiration. They learn with other campers. That's the whole point of it, right? That's the whole. Their presence adds an influence. So that's the component here of how this, nothing succeeds like competition.
Yeah, but
Right?
we also have the, I would assume from the model you're describing that if there were religious decisions to be made, anything pertaining to observance and following God's rules and the Beit HaMikdash, that there would be, people would come to them, to their
Local Levi or
local,
Kohen.
right, and ask for a decision. But then if it's not the decision they want, the one who makes the most stringent or difficult decisions will also not be part of
Maybe that's true, or maybe people will indeed abide by the principle of I have one person I go to, and when I go to that one person, I am bound by what that one person says. I always know the people who understand that halacha because they call me or they speak to me and they say, I'm looking for your advice about something, right? When they say they're looking for my advice about something, that means don't paskin, right? Because I don't want to be locked into your psak. I'm shopping for, to see what you say, right? And sometimes if somebody doesn't say that, I will say to them, listen, I'm not going to give you a psak. I'm going to give you my advice, what I think, but I don't want you to feel that you're bound by that. That's a little bit of the halachic interplay that you sort of, okay. So the tithe, right? This tithe goes to the Levi, maaser of the produce, fine, and from that the Levi has to separate and give to the Kohen. Okay, there were other tithes as well. There were tithes that went to the poor people. In year 3 and year 6, there were tithes that went to the poor people. And in years 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the Shemitah cycle, there was a tenth that additionally had to be taken and eaten in Yerushalayim. What about today? Right? What about today? We don't have tithes today, right? We're not an agriculture-based society, right? We don't have tithes today. So is there anything in the Torah that applies to my obligation to provide for the poor?
But there's still tithing.
What?
Still?
Maaser in the Torah seems to imply, right? Maaser in the Torah seems to apply to agriculture, right? That's from the Torah's perspective. It seems to apply to agriculture in a society which is not agriculturally grounded. So, do we have this concept of maaser? Yeah. Well, we all answer yes, but I won't press you on how do we know that. But I will say that there is an obligation of tzedakah, that the Torah talks about an obligation of tzedakah, not here in our psukim, but the Torah writes that when your fellow Jew becomes impoverished, so you have an obligation to support that person. How much are you obligated to give in support of that person? So the development of that is actually a fascinating work in halacha as to how do we understand the obligation of tzedakah, meaning that there is a poor person, and this poor person needs my support because he's poor. He needs my support. I have an obligation to support him. I have an obligation to support his family. And in fact, the Torah says my obligation to support his family is in the manner to which he was accustomed. In other words, if he used to drive a Chevy, so then I have to support him so that he can drive a Chevy.
And if he drove a Maserati.
If he used to drive a Maserati, so I have an obligation to support him so that he can drive a Maserati.
Which is that
Even if you
Mrs.
drive a
Madoff.
Chevy,
Right?
Hello.
What?
That's right, that's right.
No. So wait a second. So now the question is, obviously, that's not an obligation that falls on any one individual. In other words, I can't possibly support this person in the way in which he was accustomed to living. I don't have the right. I drive a Chevy. I don't drive a Maserati. So I can't support him in that manner. I can support him based on my individual obligation. Good. What is my individual obligation? So I have an obligation of tzedakah, but how much? What are the limits on that tzedakah? So the Mefarshim, the poskim, develop that there is a lower limit on tzedakah and there is an upper limit on tzedakah. The lower limit on tzedakah is, anybody know what it's called? Maser. Right? The lower limit on tzedakah is called Maser, and it is derived from various psukim, either directly so that it's a Torah obligation, or according to some, it is a rabbinic obligation. According to others, it is a minhag, that we are obligated to give 1/10 of our income to people who are aniyim.
Before or after tax?
Right? 1/10, what?
Why people? What about everything else? What about JMF or?
Okay,
They're
so
saying
we,
that institutions
right, so we are
figure into
obligated to give 1/10 of our income to aniyim, to people who are impoverished. So now we have a couple of questions, and it's connected to this. It's connected to this maser. It's connected to the word kol that appears a few times when it refers to maser, right? Mikol, from all of your produce, and we derive mikol. It's a ribui. It includes all of your profit, your gain. So there are two pieces here. Element number one is that a gross or net number? Meaning, does that apply to my gross income over the year, or does it apply to my net income over the year? And if it applies to my net income over the year, does it apply to my IRS net income over the year, or does it apply to my halachic net income over the year? In other words, my IRS net income over the year is getting smaller, right? But it is dependent on certain deductions that I am allowed to make from my gross income. Are those deductions consistent with Torah deductions? Am I allowed to take the same kind of deductions when I calculate my halachic net income? And that's component number one, which is a class in and unto itself. Maybe one day you'll be interested in that. The second element is, on what am I allowed to spend my ma'aser ksafim? On what am I allowed to spend my meiser money? If I am a grandparent helping to pay tuition for my grandchildren at yeshiva, am I allowed to factor that in to the 1/10 of my charity money? Am I allowed to consider that as ma'aser? Am I allowed to use my ma'aser money for that? If I am a grandparent,
Can you?
Sounds like another class rate.
if I am a grandparent who is helping my children pay their mortgage, am I allowed to deduct that from my ma'aser money? These are very practical questions. If I buy a lulav and esrog, am I allowed to deduct that from my ma'aser money? If I pay tuition for my children, Am I allowed to deduct that from my Meiser money? All of these, I'm not giving the answers. I'm just raising the questions, right? I'm just raising the questions that this is a very, in other words, yes, it is true that responsibilities to Kohanim and Leviim that we read about, that we're learning about, no longer apply to us. A, because we do not know the precise identity of Kohanim and Leviim, and B, because we don't live in an agricultural society. We don't have a Beis HaMikdash. There's not the avoda anymore. Although there are certain opinions that say that this obligation to support Kohanim and Leviim was not dependent on there being a Beis HaMikdash. Even when there was no Beis HaMikdash anymore, even when there were no Karbanos anymore, there was still an obligation on the Jewish community to support Kohanim and Leviim. That was their nachala. Nachala means forever. Today we don't know who the Kohanim and Leviim are, so we don't support them to that extent. But I do have an obligation to support the poor that is based on this paradigm of maaser. And it is a serious obligation, according to some a biblical obligation, and it requires us to pay attention to it. Requires us to make calculations. April 15th, we all worry that our calculations are done in time for the government, but how many of us worry at the end of our fiscal year, however you set up your halachic fiscal year, how many of us are worried that we are actually fulfilling our obligation of maaser? Right? And that requires a calculation of what is my income, what can I deduct from that income, and what is my number for maaser, and what can I use that maaser money from, to know whether I have more left over, or I have to give, I have to allocate more. That is a halachic obligation as well.
What's
and
the
that's
upper limit? You told us the lower limit.
the upper limit is 20% of your income, a fifth of your income. A double tenth, aser asrenu. 2/10 added together is, 1/10 added together is 2/10, which is 1/5, which is 20%. The upper level of your tzedakah is limited at 20% of your income, assuming that you can afford that 20%. Right, assuming that you can afford that 20%. There is in other words, if you can afford more than that 20%, you can give more than that 20%.
Then what is the 20%, who's the 20% for?
And so in other words, you can give up to 20% if you can afford it. If you can't afford it, so then you're not obligated to give more than the 10%. What if you can't afford the 10%?
Right, if giving the 10% puts you into the recipient.
Okay, so we have to be very honest with ourselves.
Right.
If giving that, right, if you claim that giving that 10% puts you into the impoverished category, so then you have to look very carefully at your at your expenses and see, is that really accurate?
Do I really
Right?
need to feed my
Think about
kids?
the true.
So the true ani,
We need the Burberry
Who
coat.
are poor.
so the true person who is an ani, the true person who is a poor person, has an obligation as well to give if he earns more than the poverty line, more than the halachic.
He earns, or if he collects?
No, earned. Well, collecting is also earning,
Disposable.
right? The collecting is also earning
So
from either his
presumably,
collections.
You could be giving double maaser then. Let's say somebody comes to the door, he earns a lot. So he's giving maaser part of money.
He is supposed to give. He is supposed to give maaser from what he earns, assuming that he earns enough. I have a feeling there are some who earn enough for
More than-
20%. All right, but right, my favorite
With the
story. My favorite
driver.
story of meeting the one of the tzedakah guys at the Homoac. Right, I was at the Homoac for camp visiting weekend, and I look over at the other table, and there's one of the tzedakah guys with his family, and I could not help myself.
Was he
And
collecting for himself though, when he came to you?
yes, of course.
Yeah,
So
go-
I could not help myself. So the next time he came to collect, I said to him, explain to me something. I'm supposed to give to you, and you go away with your family to the Homoac? And he said to me, I'm entitled to a vacation also, right? So there's a whole, I don't know.
Right, there's a caveat there.
People, scholarship because their parents take them to Florida.
Correct.
So-
That's correct.
so it's
In
the
other
same-
words,
so it's
today,
the same type of thing.
correct. That's correct.
So when you say there's an upper limit, it doesn't, it's interesting that the upper limit would indicate that there's some auspices that's saying, okay, you don't have to give everything, it's not open-ended, but you have to give this much. Who is this group? Who's making this kind of value judgment? Because to me, if you would. it would
Every
be-
individual is obligated to do that.
Okay, so it's.
Nobody's coming to you and saying, Raylene, did you give your maaser?
I understand that,
Nobody's
but
doing that.
psychologically, it would
There's
make
no
sense to
Meister
me
police.
that you would give all of it. In other words, the progression should be that
How would you
at
get,
some
why,
point-
then what would you live on?
But that's the whole thing. If you want.
No, you are not supposed, you're supposed to give 10% of your profit, not 10% of your principal.
Okay, so it's not as if you have to take
You
a
are
vow
not
of
right,
poverty.
correct, that's correct. Okay, everyone, see you next week.
Thank you.
You said no